Welcome everyone. We're really pleased to have Dr. Lorianne Dolloff with us today. And normally our Shared Perspective series has been part of the choirs. And today we are with our Foundations in Music Education class. So thank you to all the guests today joining us. And let me just read a little bit about Dr. Dolloff. She's been a professor of music at the University of Toronto since 1994. She's the coordinator of the Music Education Department and teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in choral conducting, music teaching, and research methods. Her work as an educator is grounded in the teaching of Kodai and Orff, practices that have informed the teaching of elementary music education at U of T during her career. Lori has also become very passionate about teaching in the Arctic, which is why we have invited her here today. Has visited many northern communities frequently, and she'll talk more about that work. Spending time with children in the schools and conducting, I think, an annual choral festival as well. Dr. Dolloff will be sharing a presentation. You can at any time put questions in the chat, as always. And at the end, there'll also be time for live questions if you wish to pose them as they arise. So I will turn it off to Dr. Lorianne Dolloff. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am thrilled to be here this morning. Thank you for your welcome. This has become even more important in the past little while with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and with Black Lives Matter and the events of the spring. It's not new. It's something we should have always been attending to. It's knowledge we've always had, but increasingly we cannot ignore it. And so this morning I'm going to talk to you from my own personal experience about how I am grounding my own music education practice and hoping to share with my students a bit about the role of cultural humility, and I'll define that in a little bit. Cultural humility in intercultural collaborations, and particularly with our Indigenous peoples. Okay. Oops, there we go. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that the land I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. This land acknowledgement was posted on many of the bus shelters in Toronto, and I love it because you're called upon to put your hand on the hand. You can't see, but I'm doing it now. Your hand on the hand and make that acknowledgement your own. And I think that that is such a powerful statement because we hear the land acknowledgement and sometimes it just becomes normalized and rolls off our back. And so I encourage you to actually make that your own by putting your hand on the hand. I grew up on the lands of the Toronto Purchase and the lands adjacent, some of which, as it says, were Treaty 13, and some of which were just taken without treaty and illegally. I learned how to skate on the Credit River. You see the picture there. It's also known as the Misinihe, which translates to the trusting river, the trusting water. My youth was spent hiking along the shores of the Credit River, canoeing the river, being aware that First Nations people had lived here on the shores of the Credit River where I walked, but not being aware that they still existed. I came from a family who was respectful of, but maybe exoticized First Nations culture. We consumed their artworks, we collected their artworks, we loved to visit Indigenous sites and Indigenous places. And I remember being very fascinated with archaeological digs that happened along the shores of the Credit by the University of Toronto Mississauga campus, none of which now, given my new perspectives, I would consider as a respectful way of interacting with our Indigenous peoples. In my youth, my father told us stories of times that he spent in a residential school as a young caretaker. So he was about the same age as the older students, and he hung out with Indigenous friends. He sadly didn't last too long because the school nurse was giving them all shots and gave them all shots with the same needle. So many of them caught hepatitis, including my father. And he was shipped out to recover, but his friends sadly were not, and many perished at the school. So I had these stories kind of roaming around in my head. But I went about my way, and I learned Kodai, and I learned Orff, and I learned how to choral conduct, and I worked in churches and played the organ. And my life was much as it had been for many, many years until I got the call to go north. And so I also want to acknowledge that my work is informed by my journeys to Iqaluit, to Pangnirtung, to Rankin Inlet, and to acknowledge the Inuit, the ancestral people of the Kikitani region on Baffin Island, for the welcome and the teaching that they extended to me. We're going to deal with story a lot today. And the story I'm going to start with is Alice and the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? Said Alice. That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that if you only walk long enough, said the cat. In music education, we have gone many paths, and often it's because we don't know where we want to get to. And so in music education, as we meet the Cheshire Cat, we may think we want to go to general music, bucket drumming, ukulele, the classical canon that many of our institutions are founded on, rock band, wind ensemble, world music, recorder, informal learning, popular music, jazz, Kodai, or if the list goes on, and you can add your own, I'm sure. Each one of those specifies a different path to music education, a different set of skills that we learn, a different set of attitudes that we bring with it, and a different set of assumptions about who our students are and how we interact, how we engage with them. But as we're confronted with the truths about the history of Canada, about the neglect and persecution of our Indigenous peoples, I think that we need to consider other paths and other ends. And so we need to look at other ways that we need to go. So I want you to consider, what experiences have you had, you personally had, that have set you on your path to where you are now, sitting in foundations of music ed, or as the guests who are with us today? Who was with you? Where did it happen? Why was it significant to you? And what was the effect? And then, what experiences had you had that challenged your direction? Who was with you? Where did it happen? Why was it significant? And what was the effect? And so for me, this was where we're going to start today. We're going to start with the experience that challenged my own direction. My trip, my very first trip in 2009 to Iqaluit. Since then, I've been 17 times and broadened my base a little bit to include Pangnirtung and Rankin Inlet, but mostly I'm in Iqaluit. Excuse me. And I do this because, as Arthur Frank reminds us, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. And so having been confronted with this mandate, or this call to change my practice, to challenge my practice, I have to think about where I came from. And so that's why I started with the acknowledgement of where I grew up and what I knew and how my family had raised me in response to Indigenous issues. And so I really think that the act of reflection then becomes a way to make those stories visible so that we can use them as a resource And so we can see where we need to challenge and what we need to push in order to move forward. And so you can see the young Lori walking around the forks of the credit with the walking sticks that my grandfather made for me. You can see me in Iqaluit in the blue sweater, working with the many students there. You can see me in my academic vestments, my academic robes, with some of my students at convocation. And then you can see me in Newfoundland with some of my community choir members being screeched in and not quite liking the screech. And of course, the one down the bottom with me exploring a new territory, both literally on the land of Frobisher Bay. I'm actually standing on frozen Frobisher Bay, and exploring new dimensions and new directions for my teaching. That's June in Iqaluit. Okay, so I was first asked to come north in 2009, as I said, and to work in the schools. And I said, well, I don't know anything about Inuit culture, and I really don't know what I have to add to what you're doing in schools. And they said, just come and do what you do. Bring one of the folk songs that you've arranged, because I had arranged several Newfoundland folk songs by that point, and Irish folk songs. And you teach them, we'll teach you Inuktitut, and we'll teach you one of our songs in Inuktitut, and we'll be great. We'll have at the end of it all, we'll have a choir festival. And so that's what I did. But I really found that was not enough, that bringing Southern understandings to the North and my comprehension of how and what music was not meeting where the children were, was not engaging them in exploring the music that was around them, and was really just contributing to a recolonization or a reinscribing of colonization to the population here. It's not completely Inuit. You can see that there's several non-Inuit people here. In fact, it's about 60% Inuit and 40% non-Inuit now. There's many, many more non-Indigenous peoples going north. And so I began with, I met a friend up there who had come down to, actually I met her down here in Toronto, who had come to study Indigenous studies at the University of Toronto. Her name was Regali Alaru. And I met her because I had bought a stone carving and it had got chipped in transit, and her husband fixed it for me. And so Regali and I began to work together. We told each other stories about where we came from, and we decided that we needed to create specific music to take north for the children that referenced their experiences of the land, that helped them reclaim the things that were around them, so that we weren't singing songs about trees in a place where there were no trees. It's above the tree line, so there's not a single tree to be found. There are willows, but they grow horizontally along the ground. And so you see the pussy willows laid out on the tundra surface in the spring, which is really delightful. But I digress. I have a thing about pussy willows. Anyway, Regali and I started working. So one of the things that I had read before I went was a piece by Joan Russell, who was from McGill University. And she had written a piece, an article called "What's to be Done with the Fox." And Joan had gone up a couple times to Iqaluit and worked with teacher educators, teachers in training, and was trying to have them write songs, create songs. And she had been teaching them her Kodai repertoire of songs. And she sang, "A-hunting we will go, a-hunting we will go. We'll catch a fox and put him in the box, and then we'll let him go." And the Inuit teacher said, "Why would you let him go after you put him through being caught? And this was the gift to have the fur. Why would you let him go?" And she realized at that point that her cultural understanding was embedded in her songs. And so she had not examined the song she was using for those cultural understandings and how that might not be understood, or how that might run counter to the cultural understandings in the Arctic. And so Regally and I worked, and instead of three little monkeys swinging on a tree, along came a crocodile as quiet as can be. Does anybody know that one? Yeah, I see some hits. Okay. So instead of that, then I worked to see, well, what kind of animals and what kind of relationship between animals does that embed? And so I came up with three fat seals sliding on the ice. Along came an orca. He thought they'd taste nice, and then had regularly translate that into Inuktitut. And so we would then teach it in both English and Inuktitut. And those children who spoke Inuktitut at home were reaffirmed. Those children who were Inuit but not speaking Inuktitut at home because of the legacy of residential schools could start to begin to learn Inuktitut to back up what was happening in the schools. And the Halanat children, or the non-Inuit children, would start to get some words in Inuktitut, because the key to reclamation of culture is language. And music embeds language in such a powerful way that we found this was an excellent way to help the children along, and not just the children, the older students as well. And you can see adults along the back. Some of those are teachers and some of those are the community choir. And so I use some of the same material. And this is a view from our one of our choral festival experiences. The children asked if I would wear the amauti, or the same Inuit garb. They modeled on the parka, but they use it now as a performance dress, and as well as everyday clothing. But this is our performance amauti. And you can see that we are at this point singing "Give Us Hope" by Jim Papoulis. And you'll notice the various and sundry levels of engagement, but this was, as we were evolving, music that both spoke to where they are. "Give Us Hope" speaks about the future being in the children, and the need to listen to the children for what it is that they want, what they need. And so as I continued to balance, I made sure that every year we had a piece in English that would speak to their reality, but also a heavy dose of local artists and music in Inuktitut. And very quickly, I had the National Arts Center, who was sponsoring me in these trips, send an Inuit musician with me, so that I was not taking the Inuktitut language and mangling it, but that we had a native speaker and a native musician along with us, and a local musician along to teach songs. And so we were doing popular songs in Inuktitut, we were doing created songs in Inuktitut, and I'll talk about the final bit of collaboration on that project in a minute. So this all raised questions for me, for the teacher that I was, for the teacher that I am and continue to be. The first one: how do my childhood and enculturation in Southern Ontario, ingesting stories of the imagined Great White North that we all have heard about — I'm just going to move your pictures along so I can read my script here — and act as a resource for the stories that I tell about my teaching in many contexts and dimensions? How do the stories that I am, the stories that I've been a part of, if you think back to my quote from Arthur Frank, how do the stories that I've been a part of continue to influence the stories that I am now? And how might my ideas of appropriate repertoire choices, because this is what I struggled with from the very beginning, and the ways that I teach them, be acting to recolonize or to civilize the groups that I'm working with? And historically, this has been one of the foundations for the notion of residential schooling, an opportunity to civilize First Nations people. And as wrongheaded as we see that is now, that was the reasoning, that somehow civilization inhered in Western European thought and not in anyone else's cultural practice. Third thing: how does my story and the way that I tell it to you continue to perpetuate an imaginary North, one where everybody travels by dog sled and eats raw seal heart? how does the way I tell my story continue to perpetuate that stereotypic North and Inuit culture as simple and historical, much the same way that I saw the archaeological digs as situating the Mississauga First Nation as historical, rather than seeing my Inuit friends and my Inuit students as both living in a complex intersectionality of experience and culture and a contemporary culture. One of the things that I noticed when I asked myself that question is when I bought soapstone carvings or serpentine carvings, and I believe me, I bought quite a few. I would always buy the Inuit on a dog sled. I never bought the carving of an Inuit on a snowmobile or a skidoo. And I always bought the drum dancer or the throat singers. I never bought the carving of the Inuit playing the electric guitar. And I thought to myself, yeah, I'm buying the historical figures. I'm not buying the contemporary figures. And so that for me was a pretty telling feature. And then I belonged to the Anglican Church, which was implicit in running residential schools for the government of Canada. And so how does my position as a member of that group reflect in my practice when I'm working with the local Anglican Church Cathedral Choir? How do I interact? And I have a story about that a little later. And then what lessons can I learn that will benefit my university students as they seek, or as you seek, to decolonize your own practice and your engagement with intentional inclusion of different cultural perspectives, of Indigenous cultural perspectives, and to be inclusive of many cultural perspectives. Okay. So people often ask me to speak about best practices, and best practices has got to be something that I really, really dislike, because best practices has a connotation that there's nothing that can be done to make them better. And I know that's not inherently what people mean, but it just, best practices always kind of wrangles me. But I found this quote from social work that I really, really like. Best practices becomes less than a noun, less than a set of predetermined things to do, and more of a verb, a way of engaging and respecting active engagement by others. Evidence of what is working can be recorded, shared, and used to make active choices about how to respond next. And you'll see a theme, I hope, coming up about always reflecting on what has been so that we can make better choices, so that we can determine our next steps. And so in terms of best practices, I don't have any best practices to share with you today. I can't tell you how to do this. I can only tell you the stories of my engagement and how I think about it and how I challenge myself moving forward. One of the other things, I was asked to write a chapter for a book on cultural competence or intercultural competence because of my work with Indigenous populations. And that's another word that I hate, because cultural competence to me suggests that there's a checklist that you can check. Yep, I got that, I got that, I got that. Okay, I must be competent culturally or interculturally. And, you know, again, that's a rather reductive definition. Some of the definitions, the ability to successfully teach students from cultures other than our own, develops interpersonal awareness, sensitivities. But you see that all of this puts the teacher first. All of this has the teacher as the one who is doing everything to make the culturally competent classroom work, mastering a set of skills that taken together underlie effective cross-cultural teaching. And again, anytime I'm faced with a checklist of skills that if I can tick it off and say, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I feel a little bit antsy. And so healthcare has really been leading the way in this, social work and healthcare. And so it was in healthcare where they saw that, you know, a doctor being able to check off a list that, yeah, they know that there are different perspectives from their own, and they're able to address needing a translator for accessibility, et cetera, et cetera. They'd filled out the checklist, but they saw that it still wasn't working. And so they moved to a framework of cultural humility. And I am really, really grateful to one of my students who in her undergrad found this from her mother, who was a nurse and a nursing instructor. And for me, this embodies the attitude and the dispositions that we need to think about when we're talking about working with a whole range of cultural experiences, of cultural perspectives, of life stories, the stories of others. So cultural humility is proposed as a more suitable goal in multicultural music education. It incorporates a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation, self-critique, to redressing the power imbalance in the teacher-student dynamic, and to developing mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic learning and advocacy partnerships with communities. And this is where I'm grounding this cultural humility with the interaction and collaboration aspect of what I was asked to speak about today. So humility, cultural humility puts the teacher not in the spotlight, other than they are examining their role in it, but it doesn't have anything to do with what you are, a set of skills that you are learning so that you can more properly interact with others. It has to do with examining and re-examining your own practice and your own perspective. And at the same time, it doesn't set about to blame us or judge us for our past behavior. I love the quote from Maya Angelou: "Do the best that you can until you know better, and then do better." And so that for me is what the key is. It's not a matter of blaming ourselves for the history, the forgotten history, but it is about reflecting on the emotions, the biases and assumptions so that we can use that as a starting place for our own learning. This is about being lifelong learners, being willing to be lifelong learners of learning and teaching. So how does music fit into this? Well, music can disrupt grand narratives of power and subjugation. It can also promote them. So this is a double-edged sword, but it can disrupt them by the artists that you choose to represent in your classroom, by the voices that you include in your repertoire. It can be used to respond to residential schooling narratives. And I know some of you have read the chapter that I wrote, To Honor and Inform. And there is the example of the Rita Joe Project in there, which was specifically designed to respond to residential schooling narratives. One of the issues with the TRC, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the words of many of my Indigenous friends and colleagues, is that it puts too much focus on residential schooling as the issue for reconciliation, when there are many, many more, such as the lack of clean water, such as the lack of access to education, such as the murdered and missing Indigenous women, and the lack of willingness to really fully investigate them, to dismiss them rather as people of little worth, and so not to engage in full investigations of their deaths. And many of us saw the heart-wrenching story of a woman who was dying in hospital and the racist comments that her phone recorded by the caregivers who were standing around her deathbed in an Ottawa hospital not too long ago. Maxine Green, who is an arts educator from Columbia Teachers College, advocates for the relevance of art in overcoming the inability to see others. So music as one of the arts, but music in particular, helps us to see others, to see the world from another's perspective. And then it can help reimagine the story of our relationships. It was through music that Rega Lee and I formed a very close friendship, and in negotiating what was important to each of us in creating musics for the classroom and musics for particularly the community of Iqaluit, we renegotiated our relationship in terms of the power dimension. She was very deferential to me in the beginning, and I kept saying, no, this is about you teaching me. This is not about me teaching you, even though she was a student at the time at the university. And so it was through that negotiation, that musical negotiation, that we reimagined the story of our relationship and dismantled that power relationship. So in any of our music education ensembles or in our classrooms, we are singing and playing our stories. The repertoire that you choose, the way that you choose to do it says a lot about your personal story. And so how do we confront that? How do we confront colonialism, which is the structure that schools and universities are set up on? How do we confront that in our ensemble practice, in our music making? Well, first of all, whose musical or life stories do we present in our repertoire? Do we always sing English folk song? Do we always sing Canadian songs with a particular area in mind rather than the local area? What are our rehearsal strategies? Do we insist on being able to read music? Reading music is a wonderful portal to being able to make more music and more different kinds of music, but it's not the only way. And so putting improvisation into rehearsal so that everybody is experimenting and learns that their own voice is valuable in some way. And it's not either or, it's both and. So yes, learning how to read music is important. Yes, learning how to improvise on voice or on instrument is important. And learning how to sing and play by ear. You know, I don't know how many of you have the experience of being a musician and seeing someone who has no musical experience whatsoever, or they have musical experience, but no music lessons or musical training. And they sit down and they can play things on the piano or play things on an instrument. And we go, wow, I wish I could play that. And so learning how to play by ear is something that has been taken out of many of our ensembles and many of our classes. And I think that that's something that needs to be reinstated as one of our valuable rehearsal strategies. So improvisation, note reading, absolutely, score reading, and singing traditional musics without the use of score, not relying on it being written down in order to learn it. What do our performance venues say about inclusion and colonialism? Are we always performing in churches? Churches have beautiful spaces. I love church. I'm a church rat, but they're not always welcoming for everyone. And Kira Galway reminds us in the last point, how do spaces and places enable stories or repress stories? Kira Galway is one of our doctoral graduates. She's now teaching at Mount Allison. And she, in her dissertation, met with several members of Lady Cove Choir from Newfoundland, and that drove them around. They would tell her where to go, created a map of their memorable spots for both rehearsal, performance, and music making, and then asked them to tell stories. And so there were several stories of sacred spaces that were not welcoming to people and for individuals. There were other spaces that other people felt uncomfortable. So just being aware that the space that you have your ensemble performing in, or the way that you've set up your classroom, can enable stories or can repress them, can enable someone to claim their musical self or can repress that. And then finally, whose stories do we seek out? Whose stories do we listen to? It's not possible to listen to everything, and no matter what our best intentions, we can't. But is there a way that we can have an attitude of inclusion, an attitude that people's stories are important to us. And so I really frame this in a decolonization framework. And so looking at life beyond colonization is another way to look at it. And we are not the only continent, the only culture, Western European culture, that has had to deal with this. Sweden, Finland, Norway are reinventing their engagements and their relationships with the Sami people of the North. And it's the Sami people through their music that are helping this reconciliation, this re-engagement. And so this has been acknowledged as one way in which this looking beyond our current practices, looking to re-engage with a decolonized structure can be enabled. But then you ask me, well, what does that look like? What are the conditions that would serve to create this different encounter? We have to get this music learned for our performance. How can I do improvisation? How can I do rote teaching? How can I involve all of this different stuff? What music do I choose? How can I do a program that is going to be inclusive of people's voices? And how are agency and group dynamics balanced? You know, in a group ensemble, not every third clarinet is going to have an opportunity to weigh in on every discussion. Not every first chair is going to have a way to weigh in on every discussion. So how do we organize these encounters so that individuals feel that they are a part of a robust community and their voices matter, they are valued? So for me, it lies in the question, not what should I teach or how should I teach, even though I've just said, you know, these three parts need to be part of my choral rehearsal, but what do I want to encounter with my students? And I use that for a backdrop for my choral programs, for my class interactions. What do I want to encounter? What are the things that I want to teach through music, with music, by music, that can create a meaningful encounter for me and my students? This is the background picture is from teaching that I did in Pangnirtung, which is up Baffin Island from Iqaluit. And they're playing the traditional Inuit drums, the kilaut or kilauti, if there's more than one. And you see my Hoberman sphere on the other side. I always travel with a Hoberman sphere. And when I went in, I managed to find these drums locked in a cupboard way up on the third floor where nobody knew where they were. And I said, can I use these? Because they said, oh, there's a few instruments around, and they had Orff instruments and they had a bunch of stuff. And I found these and brought them down. And I said to the boys who had been dragged into my class, would any of you show me how to play the drum? Now I had taken drum lessons, and so I knew I had that in the back of my head, but I wanted them to be the teacher. So can you show me how to? They had never played these drums. I'm pretty skeptical when a young person tells me that, but I asked around and it was true. They had never had an opportunity to play these drums. And so they were dragged into my class when I brought out the drums and I showed them the basics of how to play it, realizing that here I was teaching an Inuit person how to play an Inuit drum and feeling a little bit embarrassed about it. Then the teachers had to drag them out of my room because this connected to them in a way that me singing gospel music with them, or even though it was a Pangnirtung is a church founded little community, or singing any of the Inuktitut songs, which they also didn't know. And I said, well, I was told that everybody on Baffin would know Kuvia Sulik Pingla. And they said, no, because the Anglican Church had its training facility here. And so we sing hymns. And so the traditional music for Pangnirtung at that time was hymn singing. And they didn't know the traditional Inuit pisik or songs. And so that week for me became a way of re-engaging Inuit artists via recordings to teach the children of Pangnirtung the songs that the community had forgotten because of the oppression of the Anglican Church Training Center being there. And so I love this picture because the Hoberman sphere that's on the gentleman's head to your right is always a big hit. They always want to know how that works. And I have bought about 20 of them now because I leave them in a community when I've been there and have to buy another one when I come back. But it shows, you know, what I was able to bring to the community was that Hoberman sphere. This was what I was bringing, but they in fact were establishing their relationship with traditional Inuit music through the drumming and the singing. And it happened to be in February, and February 14th, Valentine's Day, was the day when the sun finally rose above the mountains, the fjord of Pangnirtung. The disk of the sun finally rose above the mountains for the first time since October. So think about this. It was light because we got kind of dusk and dawnish, but the sun itself had not been seen over the mountains since middle of October. So on February 14th, all classes were canceled in the afternoon, and we all went and stood on the inlet on the fjord. And we had raw char on the ice, and we had games, and parents brought in skidoos, and it scared the living daylights out of me because 9-year-olds were zipping around on skidoos without helmets. But nobody got hurt, and we had a wonderful party on the ice. And the kids were as we were walking back, it reminded me of the times when I'd been in classrooms and taught school here in Toronto, because the kids were hanging all over me just like they would at recess when I was a teacher. And they said, sing us that song. And I said, you know, which song? Because they really like to give us hope. I use that quite a bit because it's catchy and it's got a good message. And they said, no, not that one. The one about the light coming back. And they had remembered that I had sung a song, Kuvia Sulit Punga, I am happy, I will live because the light is coming back. And it was just serendipitous that was one of the first songs that I had learned when I had gone to Baffin in 2009. And here 5 years later, I was teaching it to the Inuit children of Pangnirtung. And that was the one they wanted me to sing. And they started singing the ayahs with me. And so for me, that was really one of those intercultural encounters that I will never forget, where reclaiming that cultural history for them through music and with music became an opportunity to create a relationship with these young people who, as I say, were dragged into my classroom. They didn't want any part of this Southern white lady teaching music. Ruben Gastambide Fernandez reminds us that educators are called upon to play a central role in constructing conditions for a different kind of encounter, an encounter that both opposes colonization and that seeks to heal social, cultural, and spiritual ravages of colonial history. And again, Ruben is writing from a South American perspective, which is a different colonial history, a different colonial story. But I think that this really is a wonderful quote to remind us that the encounter has to be more than just not doing harm. It has to actively engage in non-colonial and decolonial movements. So we're going to move to one of those. And I mentioned this in the article, the chapter that some of you have read, but I wanted to share it with you live today and the recording. This is a poem by a Mi'kmaq poet, Rita Joe, who lived in Shubenacadie in New Brunswick. And she was taken to Shubenacadie Residential School. And she says, I lost my talk, the talk you took away when I was a little girl at Shubenacadie School. You snatched it away. I speak like you, I think like you, I create like you, the scrambled ballad about my world. 2 ways I talk, both ways I say, your way is more powerful. So gently I offer my hand and ask, Let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. Rita Joe got the Order of Canada. She wrote many, many books of poetry. And the thought that her own voice had been so oppressed and taken away when she was sent to residential school is at the heart of the Truth and Reconciliation movement. So the Rita Joe Project, many of you will know, was 6 high schools from across Canada. The National Arts Centre put money into this. They had their music teacher allies, Indigenous youth, local Indigenous artists, local non-Indigenous artists, and each one was to create a song-based response to that poem, I Lost My Talk. They were given funds to create a professional level video, and then these were uploaded, and these links will take you to them. Now, I think I have to stop sharing to show you this, but let's just give it a try. I think I have to share another screen. Okay. Thumbs up. Can you see it? There's no sound yet.
I am the one who walks like a king. I am the one who cares not always to win. The wars I do not care, they hurt us all. You make it so hard, you always want to win. Please believe we care and do understand. I am the one who walks like a king.
start, so we held so deep from the very start. And I was standing next to Ellis, and oh my, feeling a little confused, cause you know why? We lost our talk, but who would ever thought that we got people speaking language living in the block, but we got no clue to what they're really saying. It's sad that better what our culture is explained to remain with speech is pain that we have to learn. Dance with the spirits is the pillow of burn. Man, it's all mixed up all across the nation. Residential schools placed inside of a reservation. You take us to rapists, forsake us to places, the reservations, but we never made it order. We take a pride and ball it up, cheer. A gentle warrior.
Meet beyond the distant shore, where lies and myths are no more. Ways we talk, both ways we say, words are the wings, carry us away. I'm trying to speak, but I can't find the words. It's flashing away in the shadow walls. I lost my talk, but I lose my pride. For 500 years it's been hiding inside. No word, no sorrow, no fear, no shame. I'm begging to lose it. I'm calling, saying, give me truth, give me knowledge, give me honor, no more blame. Give me hope, give me freedom, give me love, no more pain. I'm trying to speak, but I can't find the words. It's flashing away in the shadow walls. I lost my talk, but I lose my pride. 500 years it's been hiding inside. No word, no sorrow, no fear, no shame. I'm begging to lose it. I'm calling, on my great brave, guide me so my spirit can soar. I'm a gentle warrior.
Yes, I found my talk. It stayed. I never forgot it.
So I think that's a pretty powerful statement that combines so many different voices and shows the intersectionality of people's lives and Indigenous life, embracing both and. It's not that it's only Indigenous life, it's Canadian life, it's my Inuit friends say that they are first Canadians and Canadians first. And I just think that's such a wonderful statement. So I've just got a few more things I want to share with you, and then I'll open up to comments and questions. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. Oops, I gotta do screen share first. The second, yeah, no, let's just carry on. The second one is by the students that I worked with in the high school. I didn't have any part of it, but my one of my former students, Mary Piercy Lewis, is up there and is doing an amazing job. She has just produced a book of Inuit songs for chorus, for treble chorus, and it's several songs in Inuktitut. Some are traditional and some are by contemporary artists, and she got permission to arrange them for chorus with a piano accompaniment. And so if you're looking for Inuit-centered music that is appropriate to do then I encourage you to look for that. Mary Piercy Lewis, and it's called Inuit Songs for Choir. And it's not without controversy, because many of the youth, especially the youth, the elders not so much, but many of the youth don't think it's appropriate for non-Inuit people to be singing Inuit songs or singing in Inuktitut. So Elise Bradley at the Toronto Children's Chorus bought 50 copies of the book so that each one of her singers would have their own book, and learned a song by Susan Aglukak, who is one of the first crossover artists between Indigenous heritage music and pop music. And so she was popular in the 80s, 90s especially, but she's still very active. And Susan had given permission for Mary to do this, and it was in Inuktitut and English, the song. And many of the Inuit in Toronto took offense to the Toronto Children's Chorus singing in Inuktitut. And so it was a matter of making sure that people knew that an Inuit musician, Inuit speaker had been brought in to coach the Inuktitut. And it's about involving, in a respectful way, tradition bearers, people of the language, native speakers, in coaching and working alongside when you do some kind of collaboration, so that it's not a matter of consuming. In Western culture, we consume the arts. We pay tickets, we go and we observe concerts, we consume it as we do food. And it's a different sense of ownership. It's a different sense of engagement in many, many traditional Indigenous cultures. And so the involvement of an artist or a speaker, traditional speaker, in a project ensures that the essence of what you're doing is also right, not just the music making and the diction, but the essence and the purpose. And so to this end, we have several times at the University of Toronto invited Indigenous artists in residence. My friend Rega Lee was an Indigenous artist in residence one year. She taught throat singing and drumming songs to a class of about 20, and they performed. And so when they performed these songs with Rega Lee and with Rega Lee's daughter, who is also a throat singer, Rega Lee had made handmade parkas, amauti, for them to perform in. And many of the singers felt uncomfortable wearing the cultural dress of another. And so it was another opportunity for them to examine why is it? And again, it was because of this notion of consuming and appropriating culture for the use of non-Indigenous culture. But Rega Lee had created these specifically to be worn. And so there was this kind of catch-22 about, well, should we do it? Should we not do it? And then she offered to put traditional Inuit tattooing on the face, not permanently, on the faces of the young women. And again, some were eager to experience that, and others felt that that was cultural appropriation. So these are the things that you have to deal with. And even Indigenous peoples themselves, Indigenous nation will vary from nation, and individual from individual, about what is appropriation and what is appropriate to share. Tanya Tagach, when Rega Lee and I were talking with her, said, I would never teach Haluna, I would never teach non-Inuit people to throat sing. And Rega Lee said, but they are valuing my culture. I'm sharing how I grew up with them. I'm sharing my story with them. So there was that difference of individual opinion there as well. And then we had Pura Fay come in, who was Tuscarora First Nations. She lives in New York, and she taught a course in song catching, which was actually singing songs that she herself had written, which is a far better way, if you're collaborating, to create something new together rather than to use a traditional song, because many of the traditional songs are actually the property of or belong to a family or an individual and are passed down through the generations. And so to just use a traditional song without knowing its heritage and without knowing whether it is a family song, an individual song, or a social song, you're looking for some grief and you're doing things inappropriately. The social songs are generally the ones that are permitted to be shared and can be sung by many people. Family songs can only be sung by people in that immediate family grouping, and individual songs can only be sung by that individual, and then they're passed down from elder to younger person, from that person when they become an elder to the next younger person. So knowing the heritage of the song or the flute piece that you are laying down, or even the drumming patterns, is really, really important if you're going to collaborate. So it's far more respectful, and I think a better sense of engagement to actually create something anew. And so one of my students from Jordan, a Palestinian woman from Jordan, had written a poem after she met with some Syrian refugees in the Jordanian camps, refugee camps. And it was, will you listen? Can I tell you stories about my home? Will you listen? Can I share the history of my family? Will you listen? Can I share with you my deepest, most intimate thoughts? Will you listen? And immediately I thought of the community of Iqaluit and the stories from the North that needed to be heard by the South, by the global South, and how they needed to be, we needed to be reminded to listen to the stories of other people's experience. And so I called on Reguli one more time and I said, I have another translation. And Inuktitut is famous for long words. Inuktitut's kind of like German. If you know German, you take little word roots and you put them together to make longer words. And sometimes you get really, really long words. Welsh is like that too. But in Inuktitut, if you want to say I, Junga, and you say happy, kuvia, and will be for the tense, sulik, you say kuvia sulik punga. It's one word that means I will be happy. And so it was really a challenge to, because I had set the music for this poem already. And it was really a challenge to then, first of all, translate it into a Inuktitut that made sense. And also then to make the music fit the Inuktitut words. If I were doing it again, I probably would start with the Inuktitut. But that came as an afterthought after I'd already written the music for it in English and French. And so that has begun for me a project called Heart Story. And it came out of a commission I did for the Toronto Children's Chorus about the experience of silencing Indigenous voices and my reflections on that. And Heart Story is that this, Can I Tell You Stories About My Home, is the third movement. And Heart Story is a project that I'm working through, where I am in conversation with local communities of different nationalities, different ethnic heritages, different First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities, asking them to translate the poem into text that makes sense to them, and then creating their own performance of Can I Tell You Stories About My Home with as many different languages as they want to. And I'm hoping by the end to have a piece with 50, 60 different verses that choruses can then take and fit to their local setting. Because, you know, we think of pan-Indigenous being Indigenous, and it's really important that you start at home. You start with the local. You start with the Indigenous peoples that are local to your own region when you're planning programming, when you're planning classes. If you're bringing Indigenous artists in, bring in the artists that are local to your community first, and allow that representation of voices. Allow your students to meet the people that live and have ancestral lands around them, and then bridge out from there. So I will keep you posted on Heart's story. I think it's going to be pretty exciting. I have it at the moment. It's arranged for a 3-part treble, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. So I think I'm just about finished. Let me go back to my slideshow, and then we can have a chat, bit of a chat. Play from current slide. Am I still sharing? Yeah, good. Okay. So I just want to sum up that I really see music as having the ability to make visible erased history, to bring it back to the many of the local artists are reclaiming that history. The Indigenous artists are reclaiming that history, and by foregrounding their voices, by having them at guests in your classroom, guests on your program, they are speaking and singing and playing their history. It's a form of music, of cultural reclamation, and a form of recognition of that culture. It has the potential to be a healing event. It also has the potential to not be a healing event. And that's why I said before, you really need to involve elders or participants from a particular nation or people in order to ensure that you're doing it in a right way. Music education, then, if given all of that, music education can be seen as conciliation or reconciliation, as ways of reaching out and creating those new engagements, those new encounters that will lead to ultimately to reconciliation within Canada. It can be a place where you're representing Indigenous artists, where you are showing the artistry, the skills, the musicianship of Indigenous artists. And it can also be a means to discussing and learning about difficult topics like residential schools through the Rita Joe Project, through Gord Downey's Secret Path, through many pieces by innumerable Indigenous artists. If you're having trouble finding Indigenous artists to foreground, you can listen to Jared Martineau's Reclaimed on CBC, or I'm going to say Beatrice Deer, and that's not right. Deerchild, Rosanna Deerchild, who hosts a program where she brings in artists. She talks about Indigenous issues, and those are both on CBC. The National Film Board has wonderful documentaries, so that's also a good resource for you. And just see who's in your community. There's bound to be at Brock, I know there is an Indigenous Affairs office. At University of Toronto, there definitely is. Go to those places, talk to the elders. There's elders in residence at many universities now. And even when you're not at university anymore, take advantage of having access to those people and just sit and listen to their stories. So hopefully sharing some of my story will encourage you to think about your stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori, for that. And actually, just in the last class we had together, stories was where we landed at the end of class.
Wow.
So that was the perfect, but mostly because, like you said, we get stuck. We're worried about taking missteps, or of doing it the wrong way, or of offending. And for myself, if I think about the idea of listening and telling stories, somehow that clarifies how to move forward. It doesn't answer all the questions, but you're absolutely right that we're prone to want the how-to, the step-by-step. We've talked about having a set of skills, and like you said, having that sense of competence versus humility is spot on with that. Let's open it up to questions, and this is for the students or for our guests. If you'd like to put any question in the chat, please feel free. Or if you would like to raise your virtual hand, you can do that by clicking on participants at the bottom and then raising your hand. So are there any questions for Dr. Dolloff? I'll start with one.
Yes.
This has to do with arrangements, which I've been thinking about a lot and performing. So I'm just curious your thoughts about performing arrangements, spirituals, folk songs, and such. And
Yeah.
I've come into a time with programming where I'm starting to feel paralysis in some ways, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I'm there too, and I will not do anything now without without making sure that anybody who's arranged it has the permission of the culture bearers, of the culture that's informed by it, and spirituals. And I'm getting really antsy about even performing spirituals these days. It's a tough line to toe between representing culture and appropriating culture. And I think that it comes down to having an invited guest at your concerts. I think it comes down to inviting in, if I'm going to do an Inuit piece, inviting in throat singers, be they children, youth, whomever, and having them come in and teach the audience about it, and seeking their permission to participate with them in something. I think with spirituals or with gospel music, we have a wonderful gospel musician in the doctoral program at U of T right now, Darren Hamilton, who worked with Karen Burke at the Toronto Mass Choir for many, many years. And so I had him come in and teach and lead the chamber choir that I conduct in a gospel piece. Would I have, first of all, I wouldn't have been that successful teaching that piece. But second, and more important, it was not my culture to teach. So, there's so many things that are published, and we think because it's published, it must be ethical and right. And especially if it's older, that's not a very good bet to make.
Not a gauge, yeah, for sure.
Not a gauge, yeah. So I don't have an answer other than, inviting someone in. And many, many times people are really excited to share their culture. I'm doing a program after Christmas called, well, a program. I'm working with my chamber choir after Christmas on my planned program, Songs My Mother Taught Me, which is about pieces that come from specific cultural heritages. And my idea was to invite people in who were native speakers to tell a story about the country, and then we would sing a song to tell a story about their experience living in that country, and then we would sing a song based in that language. It's easier with European, and even in some cases with Latin American, but to have people come in and work with them to educate us about the issues facing that particular location. The issue, as you well know, is money,
Yeah.
and paying people for their time, because for
time and money, right? For
too long we have taken without recompense, and for volunteers who come in and share those stories, and they need to be compensated as professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple questions in the chat. Cassandra is asking, how can we practice cultural humility in the performance of sacred music when different cultures have different ideas of what is sacred?
So again, it's talking about the cultural context of a particular piece of sacred music. So if it's from the Christian tradition, talking about where this would come within the ritual, or how, for example, an incarnatus in the middle of a mass. Many traditions in the Catholic and Anglo-Catholic tradition actually genuflect or bow their head during the incarnatus part of the credo. And so to understand that is part of the way it's composed, I think is an important part to performing it. So you don't have to believe the words that you're singing, but you have to know the cultural and the social background of the piece. And so even though people are from different backgrounds, believers, non-believers, believers in different faith traditions, explaining how a piece of music came about, how a tradition, because Western European is just one more tradition, right? It's Western European court music, Western European church music. I'm starting to refrain from using the word classical anymore.
Hmm.
And so for me, that's the answer there, is to make sure that I embody each piece, imbue each piece with all of its social and historical and cultural context.
It's doing your homework, right? About
Doing your homework.
everything.
Yeah.
Um, Nicolette's asking, can you tell us a bit about what you felt during your first time teaching in the North? I think you touched on that a little bit, but
I was so excited. I was nervous I was going to have to eat a raw seal heart because the Governor General had been there. It was the one before this one, Michael Jean. Michael Jean had been up there 2 weeks before I went, and they made a big deal about her eating raw seal heart. And I thought, oh no, that's a real thing. But in fact, I was enchanted from the moment I went, and that's why I've been 16 more times, doing various and sundry things. I was excited. I was nervous about, like, what did I have to teach these children and these adults? Because I was working with the Inuktitut speaking. Many of them didn't speak English at all. The Inuktitut speaking cathedral choir, and so nervous but excited and wanted to do more and see how I could make it better. What I did, make my practice better.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think we have 2 minutes left. Martha said, so did you end up eating it? You didn't then.
No, I did not. I have not had an opportunity. In fact, I've only seen seal on the menu once, and it's not offered at the 5 restaurants in town, and it's not. I just figure this might be my rationalizing it. I figure it's such a precious commodity. I'll leave it for those who enjoy it.
Lori, thank you so much for joining us today,
My
and
pleasure.
we're continuing on this topic beyond today with our class. So you've given us a lot to think about, and like you said, it's not just about working with Indigenous people, but thinking about all of the cultures we represent in the music we perform, and how we go about choosing music and how we present that music. So thank you for your very thoughtful presentation today.
Thank you very much. It was a delight to be here.